Whereas motion is related to the movement of the pitch between the fixed melody and the counterpoint, species relates to the relationship between the note lengths. The note lengths of the fixed melody and of the counterpoint melodies specifically. Now, there are 5 different counterpoint species which we are going to talk about. The first one is called first species counterpoint. First species counterpoint occurs when the counterpoint melody maintains the same length as the fixed melody, also known as the cantus firmus. This means that both melodies will be playing the same length notes at the same time for each and every single note in the melody. Now, I've got an example of it here in Ableton Live. And as you can see, we've got 2 melodies. One of them is playing a bass line, and another one is playing a lead a couple of octaves higher. And for every single note in the fixed melody, this would be the cantus firmus, the bass line, we have the same length of note occurring at the same time in the counterpoint melody. Now, first, what I'd like to do is play back the counterpoint melody phrase that we have written. And then I'm going to go through the different motions that are used in this first species counterpoint melody to showcase how you can use different types of motions to make it all more interesting and less kind of repetitive and I guess cheesy in a way as a result. So I'm going to highlight this section. I'm going to press Command L to activate the loop on this first little musical phrase. We've got our bass line here. We've got our upper melody here, and we have a drum beat playing in the background over there. I'll highlight both so you can see them working at the same time. Now I'm going to solo each one, so let's start by soloing the bass. And then the upper melody. And now together. Now, in terms of the motions used here, we're beginning our musical phrase on a consonant interval, being the 5th above the root. And then we have oblique motion, and again, oblique motion. Now, this is oblique motion, as mentioned in one of the previous videos, because one of the melodies is staying the same, whereas the counterpoint is moving in pitch. Then we have similar motion. So over here, the bass melody is going from an A to a D, skipping up. And then we have the same thing on the counterpoint melody, skipping up, but not by the same interval amount. Therefore, similar motion. Then back down, similar motion. And then to finish this 1-bar musical phrase, we have again contrary motion. So we've got oblique, oblique, similar, similar, and contrary motion. And we're using a combination of these motions in order to create an interesting counterpoint melody. So if it was moving in parallel motion continuously, then especially with first species counterpoint, because every single note in both the cantus firmus and the counterpoint melody plays at the exact same time, using only parallel motion can make it sound a bit bland. Therefore, you want to try all of these different motions throughout to create something more interesting. Keep in mind, though, we are starting our musical phrase on a consonant interval. And then after, we're trying not to skip too far in terms of interval. We're trying to stay relatively close. And if you notice, when we make a fairly large skip, the next one tends to be a bit less in terms of interval distance. And that's something that's done quite often, just because if from one note to the next, you've got a very large interval skip, and then you do that again, it can start to sound a little bit disconnected in terms of the counterpoint melody being connected to the fixed melody, the cantus firmus. Now, I want to also mention something that you may not have noticed, and that is that we're starting this on a consonant interval, and we're ending this bar on a dissonant interval. We're ending it on a third, whereas we're starting it on a fifth. And the reason why this works is because a dissonant interval can create a little bit of tension. It can make the person feel as though that's not quite the right sound to end on. It needs to resolve back home, back to a consonant interval. So by ending the musical phrase on a dissonant interval, then going back again to a consonant interval, it feels as though we're going back home. We're building up the tension and then resolving the tension. And that's something that's done very often, especially with first species counterpoint, because it can be so sort of repetitive in terms of how all the notes are playing at the same time, both on the counterpoint and on the fixed melody. Now, there are a few guidelines which are known as the rules of motion for first species counterpoint, which I'd like to outline. But I want you to take these purely as guidelines and not as rules, as they call them, just because if you take them as rules, it can hinder your musical composition. You know, music should be creative and open to new ideas. So use them if you need to, but even if you deviate from them, as long as what you've composed sounds good, that's all that matters. The guidelines are as follows. Begin and end on a consonant interval. This is sometimes true, but that would mean end your entire musical phrase on a consonant interval, or ideally your entire song on a consonant interval. So I like building tension on the last interval of the musical phrase if I'm going to go back to a consonant interval and the song is going to actually continue. Number 2, avoid using unisons unless you're at the very beginning or at the very end of the phrase. Unisons can sound as though you've brought the track back home, but not at the beginning or at the end of a phrase, and therefore it can sound a little bit out of place. So this would be known as a unison. They're both playing the note A. If we play this back, let's have a quick listen. There you go. So again, it doesn't actually sound too bad, but this is a rule you'll find being sort of spread around the internet quite a lot. So take these all with a pinch of salt. Number 3, avoid playing 2 consecutive fifth or octave intervals, and avoid playing 2 consecutive fourths as well. So this would be if we had a fifth interval twice in a row. This is what the rule implies. Avoid doing something like that. Number 4, use primarily contrary motion, because when you're in first species, like I mentioned a second ago, it can sound a bit bland if you're using purely parallel motion. So use primarily contrary motion. I would go further than that and say mix and match your motions. In some you can use oblique, in others you can use contrary. If you think about it, if you only used contrary, you could deviate quite far from your root pitch, and that can also make it sound a little bit stretched and less composed per se. Okay, give this a go. Compose a few different first species counterpoint melodies, and on the next video we'll go over second species counterpoint.